I want to welcome everybody here today. This is the walking tour of the Ball Square area, which has been done actually in 10 years. So for those of, it needs to be closer? Okay, there you go. All right. So this is the first time we've done it in 10 years. We've actually changed it a little bit from what we've done before. So, and we've got a beautiful day, so very excited. I usually try and limit these to 40 people. A lot of you didn't sign up on Eventbrite, but we won't mention any names. But I would ask that you actually sign in one of the sign-up sheets that are here. And that's basically to tell us that you were here. If you'd like to be on our mailing list when we very periodically send things out about other historic events coming up, then I encourage you to put your email address on there as well. Before we get started, I am kind of curious who's here from where. So let me ask, is there anybody that doesn't live in Somerville here? Terrific. Can you tell me, just shout out your communities? Milton. Okay, great. Okay. Vermont. Okay. That's it? Quincy. We don't have any Cambridge people this time? Oh, there we go. She wasn't going to admit it, but okay. We welcome everybody, but it's just nice to know. How many actually live in this area, which I will call Ball Square, Powder House, Tufts area? Oh, good. So we have about half in that area. Okay. So does anybody know this area really well from having lived here a generation ago? Okay. Sometimes we get people that come back after a very long time. So good. Okay. My name is Brandon Wilson, and I'm here as the Executive Director for the Historic Preservation Commission for the City of Somerville. And I'm here today co-leading this tour with Ed Gordon, who is going to give you a little bit of description in just a second about who he is. We do these tours on a regular basis on May for Preservation Month, the whole month, and then I usually do one in the fall. And we usually do it in Union Square, but because Ball Square is a bit impacted by the bridge closure, and we haven't done this in a long time, we decided to shift over to here. And I'm very excited that we're going to reception at the end for at the House of Kebab, which is right in Ball Square. They're putting on a very nice reception with complimentary appetizers. And many of us are going to stay there afterwards for dinner. So I'm just letting you know in advance, and I hope you'll stay to the end. Speaking of the end, it says it's 2 to 4. But I've actually arranged for us to go into 2 houses, the inside of them. And that generally takes a little bit of time. And now that there's so many of you, I suspect it'll take even more time than I estimated. So I'm going to say this will probably go until 4:30. So just give you a heads up on that. You don't have to stay to the end, but if you do, you get the reception. And in addition, the city has started something called a loyalty program for local businesses that are impacted by the bridge closures and the GLX project. So they look like this. They're cards that you get. If you make it to the end, I'll give you a card, and then anytime you go to these participating businesses in Ball Square or Magoon Square, you can use this card, and you get a certain number of them, and you get prizes, and etc. So I won't go into all those details, just so you know what's coming up. Does anybody have any questions before we kind of launch into things that they need to know about restrooms or things like that, which there really aren't any. If we go to somebody's house and there's an urge, I'm sure they'll probably let you use it. But we won't be going into their houses for very long because we just have to keep moving. But it's always to see the inside of some of these historic properties, and both of these will be. Okay, so now I'd like to officially introduce Ed Gordon, who has worked for me in the city of Somerville for 15 years.
15 years.
15 years. And so one of the reasons why he's particularly good at doing these is because he did a lot of surveying for me of historic properties or eligible properties in the city of Somerville over a long period of time. So he's gotten to know a lot of them. And so he's quite informative. Before we get going, I'd also like to recognize a very important person that is here, who is our city councilor at large, Will Emba, who's going to raise his hand so everybody knows who he is. Actually, his hat, that'll do. And we're delighted to have him here today because he's very much a part of the city. He's also learning about it. He's not originally from here, but he's always trying to learn more about what's happening in the city and stay in touch with everybody. So if you have any questions or complaints, go to him. Okay. For you that just arrived, I see you, that's great. You come on all these tours, so you know a lot of this anyway. There is a sign-in sheet, as usual, and there is a brochure that you can get from this gentleman here, or actually somebody there. There you go. Somebody else is going to hand it to you. I'd also like to introduce a docent that is here today. I'm very pleased. And a docent is a guide who actually is a volunteer that actually opens up some of the historic structures that we have in the city. There's 3, one of which is the Nathan Tufts Powder House up here, of the hill we're going to talk about. So I'd like you to raise your hand, which is Mary Mangan. She is a docent, and particularly here at oh, and then Lois, of course. Excuse me. Well, I was focusing on the Nathan Tufts. Mary typically does the Powder House here, and Lois often does the Milk Rose Cemetery. She's in the red shirt, and she's going to raise her hand. So great. The docent program is something that we do from May through October, and it opens up these structures to anybody that wants to go in during that time, and it also gives you a lot of history about it. I have here a couple of sheets that I'll just pass around if anyone is interested. I don't have enough to accommodate everybody, but we have a docent schedule, and it's ending in the end of October, so if anybody wants to go into these structures, that's on here. And in addition to that, we have the Ghost of Somerville coming up at the Milk Rose Cemetery, and I have a bike ride next week. So if people don't like to only walk, they like to ride bicycles and really cover literally a lot of ground. We will be next Sunday, same time, 2 to 4:30, doing a historic bike ride. And it's called Tracking the T, and we will be going from one end of the city to the other, finding out where all the public transportation is that's being restored in the city of Somerville. Okay, so Ed, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to hand these things around in case anybody wants one of these flyers for the events.
Okay, just a little bit of background on what I do. For the past 40 years, I have been a historic preservation consultant, which at times has meant doing historic building surveys, like the ones that I've done for the city of Somerville. It might mean writing National Register nominations, everything from the Dorchester Heights neighborhood to the Nix's Mate Day Beacon in Boston Harbor. I have been a museum administrator for the Gibson House Museum in the Back Bay on Beacon Street, and currently serve on that board. And I am also the site manager for the Old Schwam Mill, the 1864 picture frame factory museum in Arlington Heights. So I do a lot of different things. And what I want to do now is I want to give you just a brief introduction on what we're up to this afternoon. We're starting in Nathan Tufts Park, so this means that the tour is front-loaded with a very layered history from the early 1700s to the present, I suppose you could say. And then we're going to be talking a lot about the two-family house, which to my mind the best examples in the Boston area of this house type are to be found in West Somerville. And then we're going to be talking a bit about the James Cook heir family's involvement in the development of the neighborhood that runs from Willow to Cedar, Morrison to Broadway. And then we will conclude the tour in Ball Square, which the Boston Globe has called the breakfast capital of the Boston area because of so many great brunch kind of eateries. And so that's kind of where we're headed. We have here a 1934 to 1935 field house, which was built with WPA, as in Works Progress Administration, funding from the Franklin Delano Roosevelt administration. And over time, this has served many purposes, including it served as the home of a draft board during World War II. It's been where the planning department has head offices, where the traffic department has head offices, where youth programs have emanated from. And just in terms of the architecture, first of all, these granite blocks were removed from a demolished electric trolley station called the Highland Station on Lexington Avenue in Somerville. The design, the corner towered component with the conical roof cap, that echoes the shape of the powder house that we're about to see. So there's kind of a fun reference there. And inside there is what looks like a boardroom for a board of directors for an organization. And in fact, it's my understanding that you can petition the city for the use of the building for a particular organization or something like that.
My son got married up here, and we could have used this if it was raining.
So are you saying that this is used for a wedding reception, or?
Well, we could have actually.
Okay.
But it was a beautiful day. We didn't have to.
Yeah, this would be a beautiful setting for a wedding, absolutely. I should say that the land for the park, for Nathan Tufts Park, was donated by the Nathan Tufts heirs in 1892, and the park was open to the public in 1894. And this is really, really important because Somerville is really one of the most densely built up cities in the nation, and it really needs every bit of parkland that it can muster. And so by setting this aside as a park in the late Victorian times, that ensured that the powder house that we're about to see would be basically saved. And there's a lot more to say, but I just want to put it out there that the 1892 design for the park was by Horace Eaton, who at that time was the engineer for the city of Somerville. He was on the city's staff. So let's go up the hill. We're looking at the old powder house, which has been called the oldest stone structure in the Boston area. I think the second oldest would be King's Chapel in downtown Boston. So the story goes, this structure was put up about 1704 by a French Huguenot miller named Jean Mallet, or John Mallet. Huguenots, the Huguenots were French Protestants who in the late 17th, early 18th centuries had to leave France, which was, of course, and still is heavily Catholic, and so the Protestants had to find safe haven elsewhere. And Jean Mallet operated a mill, this mill here, for grinding corn from 1704 to 1747. And in 1747, and I should point out that what's missing from the top of this structure are the kind of the big blades, if you will, of the windmill. There would be this pinwheel-like, think about old mills that you've seen maybe on Cape Cod or someplace like that. There's one in Eastham on the Cape. And so in 1747, the powder house was sold to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to the Royalist government that was in place in Boston. And they proceeded to use it as the largest storage facility for gunpowder in the colony. And so as you get further into the mid 1700s, it's 1774, it's the eve of the American Revolution, and the then royal, actually military governor, Thomas Gage, thought that maybe it would be a good idea to go out here to what was then part of Charlestown. Don't forget, Somerville started out as part of Charlestown. Charlestown founded in 1629, and Charlestown once stretched, believe it or not, all the way to Lexington. That there was a kind of panhandle that ran through Arlington and to Lexington. And so Thomas Gage, the royal governor, decides he is going to send some soldiers to this site to take away the gunpowder so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands, because it's 1774. We had the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773. So there are these mounting tensions. And so 260 redcoats are sent here to take back the gunpowder. And they do this on September 1st, 1774. And they are here just slightly after dawn. And then they take this supply and they go back to Boston, but not without a small contingent of these soldiers breaking away to go into Cambridge, to the Cambridge Common, where they confiscate a couple of field pieces. That's what it says in the old histories, and I presume that means small cannon. And so they take the gunpowder and the cannon to Castle Island, where Fort Independence is today. Back then, where the fort is out there was on its own island. The connecting causeway comes along around 1900. So this was, needless to say, very upsetting to folks in these parts, as underpopulated as it was, and the word actually gets out by men on horseback going out into the countryside, not unlike what will soon happen at Lexington and Concord. In a way, what happens here is a dress rehearsal for Lexington and Concord. It's the same idea. The British are going out to confiscate supplies that could be used against them. So the upshot of this was that militia from as far away as Connecticut, Minutemen people, come to Boston, and it's called the Powder House Alarm, and not much comes of it, but it's a way to say, we're not going to stand for your overreach here, if you will. We are at the northern edge of Nathan Tufts Park, and we are standing here because back in the period of 1870 to 1892, this site was occupied by a pickle manufactory, and the product that was being made here was called George Emerson's Powder House Pickles. And George Emerson rented from the Nathan Tufts family, who lived in a house that used to be directly across Broadway from us. And so Emerson was one of many purveyor of food products in Somerville from the late 19th into really the mid-20th century. People, or companies rather, who made peanut butter, who made famously fluff. There's a fluff festival in this city. Of course, meat packing, Somerville, in a way, back then was synonymous with processed foods. And I don't think that's a bad thing, really. I mean, the city prospered from this. And I think most interestingly, Emerson pressed the old Powder House into service as a pickle storage facility. And he liked the Powder House's 2-foot thick walls that made for good insulation for his pickles. So fast forwarding to recent times, someone around here in their backyard unearthed a container that said Powder House Pickles on it. And so an artist, a sculptor, got a hold of it and cast it in bronze. And now we have little sort of statuettes of pickle jars to remind us of the Powder House pickle experience. Off in this direction, we're really talking about 4 things: the Rotary, Powder House Boulevard, the George Doherty Funeral Home, and the Tufts campus. So the Powder House Square here, sometimes called the Powder House Rotary, Powder House Circle, really officially, but I don't think anyone calls it this, is the James A. Reynolds Square or Circle. And James A. Reynolds was a professor at Tufts University and was someone who was active in the local community. We'll get to more about Tufts in a minute. But in the Rotary is a little bit deceptive. It's actually larger than you might think. It's beautifully landscaped. There's seating in there. And there's a kind of a fancy signpost with the names of surrounding towns with arrows pointing to those directions. And I tried very diligently to find who created that signpost. Could not find out, but it's a very nice work of municipal art from 1939. Next, we're going to talk about Powder House Boulevard, which starts here over there on the right side of the funeral home. And that exists on paper in the early 1890s and is laid out in 1900 to link up with Alewife Brook Parkway and the Middlesex Fells Parkway as a way for people living in the city here to escape to green space, to escape to the then very new Middlesex Fells Park that was designed by Charles Eliot. And in fact, Eliot designed Powder House Boulevard. And so interestingly, the boulevard was designed before the automobile. It was designed for horse and carriage travel. And the automobile will proliferate around 1920, where car ownership will become more common. Looking on the west side of Powder House Square is the George L. Doherty Funeral Home, the big white building with the red awnings, the kind of building that Edward Hopper should have seen and painted, very much in his aesthetic. This was the building was built about 1909, 1910, as best we can tell, from the business directories. In 1939, it becomes the funeral home. Now, the funeral home started its life around 1900 in East Somerville on Washington Street. And like so many businesses and churches, they make the move out to Western Somerville. It's pretty interesting that you have a city where, you're growing up and living in a very gritty congested, citified area, and then within your own city, you can still move out to the suburbs without leaving the city to West Somerville, which starts to develop in earnest from about 1890 on. Okay, and then the fourth thing that I want to talk about is the Tufts campus. The Tufts University, originally Tufts College, came about thanks to the largesse of Charles Tufts, who is billed as a Boston businessman who also happened to live in the Tufts homestead that used to be across the street here. And it was built around 1820, and it was the house that Nathan Tufts Jr. would inherit from his uncle in the 1870s or so. And the Tufts have a long tradition of being philanthropic. And so beginning in the 1840s, Tufts was discussed, the college, within the Universalist Church. This was started as a Universalist, a Protestant sect called Universalism, and it was discussed as a college specifically for Universalist students who needed an affordable place to go to college. This was supposed to be affordable. And so, not Harvard, right? And so the Universalists teamed up with Charles Tufts. He donated 20 acres of his land that happened to be on top of Walnut Hill, where Tufts is located mostly. And today Tufts has 150 acres. And so this was the start of Tufts College having a considerable impact on this part of Somerville, because obviously students and faculty are going to live in the area, and they are going to be the patrons of Davis Square businesses. Davis Square comes about around 1870, when there's yet another train link through the area involving, I believe, the old Fitchburg Railroad, but I'm a little rusty on that. Okay, so, and one thing about Tufts that stays with me is that in 1865, they have, along with MIT in the same year, the first Department of Engineering. So this is like, I think pretty fascinating that there's an engineering department out here in the country. There's one in Boston. And of course now Tufts is known for many things, including the Fletcher School of Diplomacy and many other things. So let's go down and walk along Broadway. I want to talk about one house in particular. Now that we're on Broadway, I want to give you some background on Broadway. The part of Broadway that extends from Sullivan Square in Charlestown and up the east face of Winter Hill, turning right onto Main Street, that is the early part of Broadway, is in middle of the 1630s. And then where we're standing, the part of Broadway that goes up and over Winter Hill and heading west all the way to Arlington Center, that was laid out in 1792. So this is a later part of Broadway, but nevertheless we think of, east and the western Broadways as all of one highway now. And then I also just want to mention that across the street, the sort of tannish yellow house that we're looking at, that was the site of the old Tufts homestead, the one that Charles lived in and Nathan Sr. and Jr. It was a fairly good sized house with a lot of L's in the back and a couple of outbuildings. Apparently that house was either moved somewhere, although I have not heard of where it might be currently, or it was just demolished as you start to get house construction here in the late 1890s, early 1900s. So we're looking across the way at 771 and 773 Broadway, which was built in 1903 to 1904, and it is one of the best preserved, most interesting, most rich in a lot of different stylistic influences. Everything from the kind of colonial revival porch columns and the second floor porch balusters. You've got a little bit of federal revival in the bowed out kind of center entrance pavilions on the first and second floor. And then you've got this angled, very Queen Anne attic oriel. You've got a clipped or jerkin head gable that harkens back to the stick style of the 1870s. Why they chose that particular rooftop is kind of interesting for early 1900s. There is some nice stained glass at work here. And it's just, the house just says that it's well cared for and that it's got all its elements, or most of them. The first people to occupy this house, one of them was a doctor, and I don't know whether that means that he just had an office on the first floor or actually lived on the first floor, and then an agent was the second person living there. And I should just point out that this area, in the beginning, as in the early 1900s, was an area where you invariably see as the job description salesman, whether it's traveling, commercial. A lot of salesmen. There will be a few doctors. There are clerks working in courthouses and for the city. And the Tufts holdings in this part of West Somerville, they're really in three parts. The part in front of us, extending from Broadway to Dearborn Street, from Pearson Road to College Ave. Then number two, from Nathan Tufts Park down to Morrison, over to Willow. That was called Powder House Farms. That was the developer's name for the 1890s and early 1900s houses that got built. And then there were the Nathan Tufts Brickyards. That's a piece we haven't gotten to yet, that extended from Willow Street to the Boston and Lowell Railroad tracks. And we'll talk more about that as we get over there. But I also just want to put this out here that West Somerville has a lot of two-family houses. And in 1915, a group of folks who lived here petitioned the city to ban three-deckers from West Somerville because they thought three-deckers invited folks that, quote-unquote, weren't contributing to the good of the community or something like that. And they were unsuccessful. The aldermen wouldn't have it, and good for them. But be that as it may, the two-family is wonderful because of the roominess of its rooms, all the built-ins that three-deckers have too, by the way. It's a wonderful, and it's a way to keep families together. Frequently you'll have a mother and father with a daughter and son-in-law living upstairs or something like that. So it very much promotes a family-oriented community.
just to add on a little bit to that, it wasn't just in Somerville. Just to be clear, that three families weren't very popular. It actually happened in Boston and other communities
Yes.
as well, so that we're not the only bias.
Right.
And the irony is, of course, and if any of you live in this area, you probably know this, but people were clever enough and they turned some of their two families into three families anyway, because it's a third floor that was actually quite large, and so phooey on them, they said. But it didn't get passed here and a lot of other places as well, and it's a wonderful housing type, the three families, and we are promoting them now in the city, very definitely. I also want to use this house as an example, like the ones in Nathan Tufts Park as well, but this is a designated historic structure. And what that means is that there's two types of designation. One is at the national level, to be in the National Register of Historic Places. This is even more significant than not. But that does not give us very much protection of the properties. So we have a local ordinance called the Local Historic Districts Ordinance, passed in 1985, that actually is subject to the review of the Preservation Commission, for whom I direct. And that means if any exterior alterations are done on that property, that that's going to significantly change its character, it is reviewed and needs to be approved by the commission. This house is actually on both the national and the local, and won as well a preservation award from the commission several years ago for the work that they've done restoring it. It didn't always look this wonderful like 15 years ago, and the owner. So I do also want to let you know we have an awards program called the Preservation Awards, which is for not only historically designated properties, but also for ones that are just older properties, which is the majority of the city until very recently. And those nominations for awards are this fall. So by the end of November, I ask for people to nominate either their house if they've done work on it, or their neighbors, or something that they pass by that they think is really notable and is in keeping with the character of the older architecture. It's not a very long form to submit, but you can get it online, the form, and then we review those in December and go out and do site visits in January, and the awards are given in May every year. And we usually have 6 awards for people that own historic properties, 6 that are just older houses. And it's a wonderful ceremony, a way to publicly recognize the people that have done work on their houses. This is only the exterior of it that people can see. So I just want to let you know that that's coming up, and if you have a house that you've been a labor of love working on in the last 2 years, or that you passed by, please let us know about it.
We are now on one of the most scenic streets in Somerville. This is Powder House Terrace, which was developed around 1900. And I neglected to mention that the Powder House sits atop Quarry Hill, that there was a quarry in this vicinity where slate was quarried, and one of the names for the quarry was Two Penny Brook Quarry, named for a once visible brook that ran north of Broadway across the Tufts playing fields and eastward, and now underground in a culvert. But in addition to milling, there was quarrying over here. And I also forgot to mention the audience for the ground up corn. That audience was coming from Medford, not further east in Charlestown or something like this. This was more of a Medford operation, but being operated out of Old Charlestown. And I suppose Arlington could have benefited from that as well. Okay, so we are looking at 29 Powder House Terrace, which was built about 1900 by one of the leading contractors in this story. And that's saying a lot, because there were numerous prosperous contractors working in Somerville in the period of 1890 to 1910, when fully half of Somerville's current building stock was built in this building boom. And typically, the contractors here not only were building houses, but They were developing entire enclaves. They were getting the streets laid out. In some cases, they were realtors. In some cases, they were insurance agents. Some of them sold hardware and paint. Some of them even had inventions to their credit, like a contractor who invented a type of gutter on another street that we'll talk about. So these contractors were doing, in many cases, more than just building houses. And not only that, some of them were involved in local politics, as was the owner, the original owner for 29 here. This was owned by Zebedee Cliff. I love the name Zebedee because it sounds sort of musical. And he, in addition to being a contractor, he, I know he was in politics, and I want to get, he was the mayor, yes, he was the mayor. Detail, important detail, he was the mayor, yes. So what we have here is one of these houses that shows the influence of the shingle style with all the wood shingle sheathing. This is a style that's coming out of, at first, high-end resorts like Newport and Bar Harbor in the 1870s, making its way into the Boston area around 1880, and still popular into the early 1900s. You also see some colonial revival in the columns, in the Palladian window. On the left side there, the sort of half-moon attic window, the demi-lune window. You've got the Queen Anne projecting oriel windows on the front of the building, second floor. It's just alive with a lot of different stylistic references that were popular at the time.
Not only is this an important house because of the architectural detail and the fact that it was a former mayor of Somerville, but it's also a designated property by the city as well as on the National Register. And last but not least is the owners of this property have graciously allowed us to go inside. So this is one of the 2 interior tours. Don't get too excited, you're not going to be able to spend 20 minutes here because there's a lot of you, which is why I often restrict these tours to 40 people. But the other thing is the owners of this property currently, the husband, Bill Taylor, used to be on the Preservation Commission. He was one of the founding people as a landscape architect. He has been wonderful to work with as far as maintaining this Nathan Tufts Park when we did a restoration work of it as well. And his wife, Carolyn Taylor, for those of you that have lived in Somerville for a while, was the school committee person for this area. So they have a lot of importance in their own right as well. So if you hold on a second, I think I'll just go up there and remind them that we're here, and then we can go inside briefly on the first floor.
Great.
I don't know how much he told you, but like these 4 houses were built at the same time by the same builder.
I think we're going to learn more than we ever knew by
This has a lot. I think this place.
because when I was working in the garden here, walking it, such a
Yeah, no, did you see it in the little sunroom?
As we walk down Powder House Terrace, I'm sure you will notice that there are 4 or 5 garages built into the rise there, the ridge, and those came later. The houses got perched up there first, and then I'm just guessing, but around 1920, the garages were dug out into the hillside. And when you look at the old maps, the garages, whether they're into a hill or freestanding, they're labeled automobile storage, which makes sense, right? So we are on Kidder Avenue, which has a number of very interesting, a lot of Queen Anne style houses. The Queen Anne is complicated to explain. It's in 2 forms. The brick form that you see in Boston in the Back Bay on Fairfield Street, and there's a lot of picturesque Dutch influenced gables, and it's the amalgam of the reign of William and Mary in the 1690s. William was a Dutch prince. He brings Dutch design ideas. And in the early 1700s, it's Queen Anne, and you have the beginnings of the very logical Georgian, the first phase of the Georgian. And so in the 1860s in England, there are architects who want to revive this intersection of the picturesque and the very logical. And yes, you see that best in the brick, but the Queen Anne out in the suburbs takes on a life of its own with carpenters who are, they're into the symmetry, the wraparound porches, a lot of projecting bays and oriel windows on the upper floors. And you get, as seen here at 3133, you get the clapboards on the first floor and then shingle sheathing on the upper floor, and like sheathing materials. And it looks like the original doors with the solid lower panels and then the square glass panes. And then what I love about this house is that even the porch posts are covered with shingles. It's not your smooth, circular colonial revival. This is probably too much feedback here, but yeah.
Keep going.
Okay. So this house was built, I want to get this right, in 1894, and the contractors in this case were Robbins and Stevens, who first owned basically this block, had it platted for house lots, and then they started to build. And so the first owners, this is a 2-family, so we're talking about a William H. Horsfeld, who was a carpenter, and Elbridge A. Bullard, whose job is listed as slate in quotes.
So there's a slate mine just up there?
I don't know. To me, this seems too late for the quarry to still be active. So he's probably...
One of the stones that the house is built out of, the tower, is called Somerville slate.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that definitely would have-
right. But I'm wondering if that's an active quarry into the early 20th century and would still be a source for slate shingles and things like that. I don't think so, but going back in colonial days, there was a quarry up there for slate. Okay, let's continue. We are at 44 Kidder Avenue that was built between 1895 and 1896. And I have to say, this is a wonderful, very pure in the sense that it is almost entirely Queen Anne. And the kind of Queen Anne that comes with a lot of bells and whistles, like these wonderful turned porch posts, the transoms that have this turned spool work, the variety of window sizes and shapes, a couple of stained glass windows. It's and it's obviously a lot of TLC has been put into this. I just want to mention that the house was built for Laura and Stephen Lewis, and Mr. Lewis was a carpenter and a partner in a contracting firm called Hudson and Lewis of East Somerville. And he is one of these contractors who had also other things that business things that he did. He dealt in real estate, he dealt in insurance, he was a purveyor of hardware and painter supplies, and so he was a contractor who wore a lot of hats. So here is the owner.
Okay, before we start, I want to say that this is another historically designated house as well from back in 1985. And I want to point out on the back porch behind myself is a historic plaque. And this is just to point out to you that the city started this program back in the 1990s, early 1990s, and revived it again a couple of years ago so that we have plaques on a lot of the properties that are designated locally. But it was up to the owner to purchase one of these. So it isn't on every property, but it is on a lot of them. And what it does is has the first name of, as we know it, of the owner of the house, and then it was built, just so you know. That's the one you'll see. I also want to now introduce the owner of this house now for many
Co-owner.
years. Co-owner, yes, of course. Co-owner, yes. We gotta get this straight. I'm already in the mud goes with her. But Todd Kaplan was on our commission for many years, as well as the legal representative on the commission, which is made up of volunteers who dedicate their skill and their expertise and their labor to the commission to review the applications that come in. And he's a lawyer, and he was representing that, just like Bill Taylor was on as a landscape architect. So he understands very much about what this is all about. Plus, he did a lot of the work on this house himself. So he's here with you now.
No, thank you. There's some interesting things to say about this house. One is that when we bought it, it was kind of a added plus that was historically designated. It's a single house as all the other ones you're seeing, as opposed to a district, which are in other areas of the city. And but it was a real plus because it means that we learn a little bit about the history of the house, and we also have some restrictions on it, as you know. But I just wanted to say a couple things. One is that when we bought it from people who had actually done a lot of the work of putting it back together, when Somerville had rent control, which, believe it or not, what it had in the 60s and 70s, I believe, this house was under rent control, and they kept on chopping it up into smaller and smaller pieces. So there were actually 5 units in this house. Wow. It was originally, of course, a 1-family, and now it's a legal 3-family. A small 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor. We have the 1st and 2nd floor, and then there's an addition, a studio addition, which my wife uses as an artist studio and therapy space in the back. But it was chopped up in 5 spaces, really willy-nilly. Drop ceilings. There was one this 1st floor was divided into 2. One person had to go use a bathroom in the basement. It was just really crazy. And the Kerr Garrity's, we bought it from, put it all back together. So really have a lot to thank to them because they did all new electric, they did all new plumbing. They really took all those drop ceilings out. It's still a work in progress, so we're not quite done. And you might have seen some houses in completely done or perfect shape, but we're still working on it. In fact, this winter, one of the things that happened was that I learned that many of those old houses, they had cast iron pipes, which is almost everybody, and there's a time bomb in cast iron. 100 years is when they will give way, and it's due to the acid in the sulfuric acid in the sewer gases going up, the pipes combining with water, turning it the sulfur to going to sulfuric acid, thinning and thinning and thinning the pipes out until they're so thin they crumble to pieces, and then you get leaks, which is what happened this winter or spring. And then I replaced the pipes myself. And then we had a friend work with us to put some lot plastering, put things back together. So you kind of get where things are back together more or less. I do have some copies of the historic designation sheet you can grab. And I just want to say one other thing about the Lewises. Stephen Lewis was born here. He went to Nova Scotia, and that's where he found his bride, Laura. and I found this all out on the web this last week. He came back and then said, I'm going back to Nova Scotia and see if Laura will wed me. She just agreed to wed him and come back to Somerville. And they kind of have a famous family. Their son was on the Board of Aldermen and was on the Windsor Hill Bank Board. And so he was born here, and he obviously grew up here as many people. And I always thought it was just like he was a carpenter, but he had, as you said, this huge, pretty successful business in East Somerville. So please welcome and ask us any questions you might have.
Thank you.
Yeah.
This is the same sort of
So fancy or different from a lot of
farmhouse,
but I guess that they
actually.
She usually goes by herself, by with her friends, but she definitely, we see her times, but she'll come with you. I've been talking to Tom about taking her to see music. As he goes to, you've seen all sorts of, never seen this guy,
Before we leave this part of Kidder Avenue, I just want to point out 45 here, which was built in 1899 to 1900 for a prosperous grocer named Charles L. Stevens. And he had a provisions dealership in Davis Square from the 1870s until about 1920. So when he builds this around 1900, he's kind of at the top of his career, and he's done well, and that's reflected in basically the volume. It's an enormous house that has now been subdivided into 5 apartments. I heard a few of you commenting on this house because of the paint color, and this is 75 Loudon Street, and what did I say?
You've been doing this all day, but it's okay.
Okay. All right. So, well, I made a joke in the script about how the grape color was appropriate because the second owner was a fruit dealer. So it's sort of, I really like this. I know I've heard that when this was first painted like this, that people were shocked, but I think now this house has a lot of fans, and I think this coloration makes you look at the elements, at the very Queen Anne porch with the turned posts, and that transom that's got a lot of punched and cut detail. It's bordering on a San Francisco painted lady, which is very nice. That's more of a product of the 1970s than the late 19th, but be that as it may, paint preserves wood. Now I'm at a point where any color, because I know it's preserving the wood, it's not vinyl, fine. So anyway, so I just wanted to make sure we all take a look at this.
And I have to add on to that because I was the one that told them about how this house was not very popular when it was first done. I live in this neighborhood, and I can't tell you how many people were just aghast at the colors. How could they do this? This is obscene, basically. So I was thrilled, frankly. And so over time, I've shared with Ed that, in fact, it has really come around, and everybody sort of gets used to things. And now when they were thinking about changing the colors, people were like, whoa, no, you can't do that. So, and what it has done is inspired other people in the city as well as in this neighborhood to consider doing it as well. And Ed just made the point that that he didn't mention with Queen Anne style houses, but one of the things that's wonderful about them is the amount of ornamental details that they have, and paint color is a wonderful way and a very inexpensive, relatively speaking, way to bring out those details, and they have obviously done that with great delight. I've met these owners before, and actually some of them from Russia, and they just wanted to do something fun, and they did it, and it's been very much appreciated ever since.
We are standing in front of the Benjamin Graves Brown School, elementary school. Benjamin Graves Brown was academic, was someone who taught at Tufts. He was the Walker Professor of Mathematics at Tufts, and I think he was on the board of this school, or he had some role here at the school. And so one of the things that's interesting about this architecturally is that you have a lot of references to the federal revival as seen in the arches of the second floor windows, in the prominent center keystones of the lintels above the windows. Then you have some classicism around the front entrance, those panel Doric pilasters. And then up at the top, there is a roof that speaks to the craftsman style, which is coming in around 1900, coming into vogue. And you see it in those brackets under the eaves, that particular type of bracket that's a little bit longer and flatter than you get earlier with brackets. So think about it. Built in 1900, what's going on all around it? House construction, young families moving in, two families, big families, not uncommon to have 10, 12 kids. So this is, is triggered by what's going on around it. The folks here need to get educated, and here it is.
That burgeoning population is kind of interesting because, as Ed said, there were really large families in this area. These two families, as you may know, the first floor is often one unit and the second, third floor is another. When a lot of us bought properties in this area, we bought from the people that had lived here for many years, and they did have families of somewhere between 5 and 10 kids living in the houses that, quite interestingly, now often have 2 or 3 kids living in them and such. But also interesting is that this was a very popular school because of the district and the residents and such, and that has come back full swing as well. I just talked to the principal recently, and he was telling me that the class sizes, they have 2 classes per grade, and now they're up to 25, which is the maximum number of kids that they can have in a classroom in Somerville, which is not a lot compared to other communities, but it's high for Somerville. In each of those classes in the first kindergarten and first grade. So it's kind of an interesting turnaround that we've had here. It is a popular school. I have to say I'm very partial to it. My sons both went here as well. But it's very different from the other schools in the city, and something that we think is very special because it is an older building. And it only goes up to 5th grade, whereas all the other schools now are K through 8. It used to go up to the 6th grade for many years. They took that away because they needed some more resource rooms, and in order to accommodate them, they actually took out 2 of the classrooms. Laura is here. Laura Petoni is the school committee person for this area, if she wants to add anything.
No, I think you hit it. I mean, it's a well-loved community school. The decision to take out a grade was really, really tough, but it was an equity issue. These students here were not getting the same kind of support that students in other schools were getting. So, and there was a real community process to try to get input to that and let people understand that they were part of that decision. So,
yeah, it's a very active PTA here. Sometimes people on the school committee probably think too active because they're quite vocal. But it is a very beloved school, as she just said. And part of that is because it's a neighborhood school, not meaning that everybody is from the neighborhood, but it's the scale of it is such as that the kids that go here, I mean, it's literally generations. And there are teachers in here, until very recently when many of them retired, who actually taught the parents or the grandparents of the kids they had in their classroom. So, it's a real piece of stability in the city, and it is one of those schools that a lot of people outside the neighborhood want to get into as well. even though it doesn't have a lot of the amenities that the newer school buildings have. We've had a great effort in the city to rebuild almost all the schools here, and certainly the elementary schools that haven't been closed have been rebuilt. They're much larger. They have gymnasiums and cafeterias and things that some parents think are very important. That doesn't happen here. The kids actually eat in their classroom. There is no gymnasium. The playground is what it is. But for a lot of parents and for elementary school children, that's what they like. So it's a little bit of a historic, not only in terms of the architecture, but also in terms of the traditions and the style.
So we are on Josephine Avenue now. We're at the western edge of the tract that was developed by the James Cook Ayer family of Lowell, Massachusetts. And what's happening here is that James Cook Ayer, the so-called sarsaparilla king, who was really the king of patent medicines in New England, if not maybe the entire country. He was big. He was based in Lowell, and he carried products like, this is at the bottom of page 7. He had products like Ayer's Hair Vigor, and all these different, cherry pectoral cathartic pills, ague cure, all these sketchy medicines that made him very rich. And he is down here in the mid-1870s buying the former Tufts Brickyard from Isaac Tufts and some of the other Tufts. And I should just quickly mention that the Tufts Brickyard was in business from around 1830 until about 1873. And I say 1873 because there was an economic downturn called the Panic of 1873 that was nationwide, a big market crash, and so that was one of the reasons why the Tufts vacated. Also because by that time, the south end of Boston had been built up with Tufts bricks and some of the other neighborhoods. So the Ayer family steps in. James Cook Ayer dies in 1878, and his heirs inherit this yet to be inherited tract, or yet to be developed tract. And so his wife is Josephine Mellon Southwick Ayer. Thank you. She has many names, but she's only married once, by the way.
And only has one first name.
And only has one first name, right. So, so this is named for her. She was one of the inheritors. And her family was heavily invested in cotton mills in Lowell, and they were also part of the anti-slavery movement. And so the houses along here from Kidder down to Morrison, there are half a dozen or so houses built first in the 1895 to 1900 period. And Kidder, thank you, too, way. That there's some lag time there. That doesn't happen until around 1900. So you get some houses down this way, a two-family built for, which doesn't sound like a lot of money to us now, but built for something like $675. Right. So that was, and so some of these houses are on only their third owners.
I feel like I have to interject here. I want to give a lot of credit for the research that's done on Josephine Avenue to one of my neighbors, Kate Zebros, who is behind us over here. She has done a lot of deed research at the Registry of Deeds and has learned a lot. I also have to, full disclosure, tell you that I live on this street and done research on our own house. And the house that he's talking about, I was amused to find that it was $675 because when we bought the house, it wasn't anything close to that. Nor is it supposedly valued at that right now. So add a couple of zeros on there, I guess.
And we have a tour of that house next time, right?
Yeah. But I was told that the builder of our house, actually, this Hala Durling, actually built this house for himself as well as a lot of the others in the neighborhood. And what Kate and I have discovered is that, in fact, if you go down the street, that originally we were the 5th house from the end of Morrison Avenue, but as it now turns out, we're the 6th house. And what I've always been told is that, in fact, that's because developers, being as they are wanting to make more money, they re-subdivided the street, the lots there, in order to squeeze another house in there. Well, what I did learn from Kate's research is it also has to do with the fact that they wanted to put a lot that was facing onto Morrison Avenue, a corner lot, and they needed to make that a larger lot to accommodate the more standard sizes there, and that's why they took away from Josephine. So there's 2 reasons for it, neither of which are particularly valid. But what it does say is that what happened in this area, like many other places, is that developers came in and they subdivided the first time, and then they sometimes re-subdivided, which is why we have a lot of properties in the city that have much smaller lots, because somebody decided that they were too far apart, you know. We just remarked about this in these very large houses that we just came from, like on Powderhouse Terrace, but even on these streets here, they decided that there was too much space between them. So, and this street going down, our house was actually the first house that was on this block, which was 1893. So he did it for himself, as I said, and then they put a lot more properties in, starting in the 1900s.
Mm-hmm. We are now on Highland Road, originally projected to be called Frederick Road after Frederick Eyre, the son of James Cook Eyre, who bought this area back in the 1870s. And Frederick Cook Eyre was, with his father's money, was a philanthropist who actually gave money to build the Eyre Town Hall in Eyre, Massachusetts. And I don't know whether his family came from out that way originally, but there was some connection. What's interesting is we've been walking along, you've noticed that there are these unusually wide green linear strips that extend from the sidewalk to the curb. And I think this is trying to compensate in some way for a lack of a small park that was originally projected for this neighborhood. This neighborhood was, still is as far as I know, considered to be Highland Park, yes? That was the historic name. And that there was projected to be a small park in the center, which never came to pass, but this 10-foot strip along here, and on the other side as well, this is an 80-foot, somewhat unusually wide road here, became the scene of a lot of building activity between 1901 and 1909, and most of it, all of it was done by Wilbur Rice, who there's some note that he built over 2,500 houses in the Boston area, 1,600 of which were in Somerville alone. So he was very prolific, and he was also one of these contractors that had a lot of side businesses. And he would have continued to build past 1909, but sadly he passed away. The heirs are interested in this area in part because it is so close to what was then called the Willow Street Bridge Railroad Station, later the North Somerville Railroad Station, soon to be called the Ball Square Green Line Station when the Green Line extension goes through in 2021. Is that, Brandon, are we on track?
December 2021.
Okay. So that was another rationale for, wanting to develop in this particular part of the city. So, want to keep going? Yes.
No, actually, we have another 10 minutes before we're going to be at the restaurant. I did want to mention, just to clarify, that when he said we didn't talk about Rogers Avenue, but that was actually another one that was developed as one of the ones that was part of the Tufts tract land as well. And that the person there was the congressman that you wanted to mention, the Jacob Roberts, and he was the father of the Foreign Service. Also, the money that they gave the Eyre family that was in Lowell, that he mentioned, Frederick Eyre, gave money to the Eyre Library, not the City Hall, just so. But also, just want to point out about trees. Another thing that's very current in the city is people love trees in many cases in the residential areas. And so some of these trees here have actually been here for many decades. And so that's one of the things that makes it distinctive and why a lot of people like living on this street as well. And this is all part of the tract, of the Tufts tract land.
Okay, we are now in Ball Square at the intersection of Broadway and Boston Avenue. And Ball Square was named for John Nichols Ball, who really had the first commercial concern in this area on the south side of Broadway, further down between Josephine and Rogers. It was a factory that some sources say, some sources say pasted shoes. I've read that he just made the insoles for shoes, but it was tied to the shoe industry. And so John Ball, in addition to being a businessman, was also a politician. And he served on the Board of Aldermen here in Somerville, and he also served as a state representative. So that is where the name Ball Square is coming from. Across the way behind the chain link fence is where the new Ball Square Green Line extension station is going to be. I'm hearing in December of 2021. And that is historically where the first station, well, the train comes through for the first time in 1835, the Boston and Lowell Railroad, a freight rail at first, a few years later accepting passengers. And over time, the station will be called the Willow Bridge Station, that being the site of the old Willow Bridge, and the North Somerville Station by the late 1890s. And so this will be a huge boon for business around here, and everybody cannot wait.
Including the businesses.
Including the
Most
businesses.
certainly.
Okay, so turning our attention to Kelly's Diner. This diner was constructed in 1953, not here in Somerville, but down outside of Newcastle, Delaware. And it was brought up here in the early to mid 1990s, and it is reportedly the largest type of diner that diners usually aren't that big. That's my point. In 25 words or less, they're usually not that big.
25 feet, and it's two pieces.
Right.
What you wanted to talk about.
Right. There used to be one in Elm City, in New Haven, Connecticut, called the Elm City Diner, that was about this size, and it had a grand piano in it, and you could go in at lunchtime and hear somebody playing and singing the piano. Okay. Since the 1990s, you have Kelly's, which was called by Yankee Magazine one of the top 5 diners in New England. It's been featured on the Food Network, and I recommend the omelets. Okay. We are looking across the street at the Hilson block, which was built in 1923, and a big part of this block that's no longer with us off to the left was the old Ball Square Theater. And this whole complex was designed in 1923. And really the first quarter of the 20th century was when you got these multi-purpose theater plus commercial buildings getting put up. And if you turn to page 10, you can see the way the theater originally looked. And at the far left, there used to be this great arch and a gable, and there used to be two full-length Corinthian paired Corinthian pilasters, and that detail was lost in a fire in the 1980s when a pizzeria occupied that end space. But going further back, let's talk about the theater. It was one of the Locatelli family theaters that included the Somerville Theater that is still going strong in Davis Square, the Capitol Theater in East Arlington that is still very much in business, and now the centerpiece of the East Arlington Arts District. So there's still a lot of nice detail on this building, nevertheless. The pilasters that you can think of as flattened out columns that are purely ornamental and have these nice stylized Corinthian capitals, and then the entablature up near the cornice that has these little ovals with urns inset, very Federal Revival, and then near the very top by the actual cornice is a dental course, what looks like piano keys or teeth. This literally references dental work, the dental course. And then at the top are these, I always get these mixed up, they're either anthemions or antefixes, but they are coming right out of classical Greek architectural vocabulary. Okay, so let's take a look at our last stop. We're turning our attention to Lindell's Bakery, which really starts the whole breakfast story, I think, in 1887. It started by a Swedish immigrant named Lindahl, not Lindell, and he thought he would make it sound more American if he called himself Lindell. And he starts by selling pastries and such out of a push cart in 1882, and by 1887 he can actually have a store. And it's interesting that over time there have been 4 owners. Actually, Lindahl owned the bakery business for 45 years. And then the next 3 owners, they continued the Lindahl line of pastries, but they added things to the menu, either reflecting maybe their ethnicity or something like that. But this is, of all the businesses in Ball Square, Lindell's is the one that people seem to know from far and wide. People know about this.
In fact, they know it so well that they still come back for their traditional holiday pastries, cakes, breads, whatever it is that the holiday is. And they come from 50 miles away in order to get that traditional pastry and such. And they also employ a lot of local youth here. And so the kids come here as well because they have great cupcakes and cookies and things. And they're actually a partner to the Brown School as well. So they're very much part of the community in every sense of the word. And it is not, the oldest building here, because the preliminary research that we were able to do suggested that where the Kelly's Diner is, right next door to them, that's the site of the oldest building, which is pretty plain. It's only 1 story, so we have to do a little bit more research to determine that. But most people think of Lindell's as the oldest business in the city as well as the oldest building. And it reflects that in terms of the signage and such, and they've talked about changing that, but then there was a big hue and cry that no, you can't do that, so we'll see what happens. So now we're going to go across the street to the House of Kebab. If some of you are leaving, it was great having you here, but you're all welcome if you'd like to come in and get some complimentary appetizers that's been generously offered by the House of Kebab. Like all the businesses in Ball Square, They would love to have more of your business, not only today and tonight, many of you are staying for dinner, but in the future, because it's tough with the bridge being down. They don't get a lot of the traffic coming by that they could. It's a bit more of a nuisance to get here, they think. So I'm just going to urge you all to think about that. I will be giving out those loyalty cards that I promised in the beginning, so that you can come back and actually go to various businesses here that are participating, get your stamp, and maybe win a prize. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank
If you
you.
come inside, there'll be an opportunity to talk to both Ed and I.
Thank you all very much. And thank our cameraman, who's been a great sport, Bill. Thank you.